and welcome to our global launch of the roadmap to net zero aligned carbon market regulation. We're launching today on the 10th of October 2025. This video is an explainer video to unpack the roadmap and introduce its context and, crucially, the next steps for its implementation. So I'll provide some context as to why we were developing this roadmap to net zero aligned carbon market regulation. I'll unpack the 6 high-level principles and pillars that it offers. We'll then turn to my colleague Cindy, who will unpack the global applications of the roadmap, and my colleague Dr. Barbara Gupta, who will explore and illustrate some of the learning by best practice that we've seen in terms of regulatory developments to date before we close out. So just to kick us off with, it's really important when we appreciate carbon markets as a topic that they are a very complex area of global policy. And this is because there's actually 3 different forms of carbon markets that we see to date. On the one hand, we have the voluntary carbon market. This is often trading carbon credits, which are project-based units representing 1 ton of CO2e avoidance, reductions, or removals. And oftentimes, these are the kinds of carbon credits that corporates or individuals use to offset their emissions. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the compliance carbon markets. Now, these are forms such as emissions trading schemes or carbon taxes, and oftentimes they represent the allowance, or in other words, the right to emit 1 ton of CO2e. Now, both these forms of unit, while distinct, often do have some form of interrelation. So some systems enable the trade or surrender for a carbon credit in lieu of an allowance-based measure. And this is critical because it also means that these systems interrelate and combine together. One key way in which they combine together is indeed the carbon markets facilitated by the United Nations. And we have, again, various forms of those. We have emissions trading schemes that emerged under the Kyoto Protocol amongst Annex 1 countries. But we also have a new form of carbon trading emerging under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, these being cooperative approaches under Article 6.2, as well as Article 6.4's Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. So with all these different domains in mind, we can see how the carbon market ecosystem is increasingly complex. This makes it a challenge to regulate. And so why is regulating carbon markets indeed even important? Well, carbon markets are increasingly intersecting, and they require governments to create more comprehensive national frameworks in order to align on the design of their carbon trading schemes nationally, as well as outline clear plans for their engagements with international carbon markets. Indeed, in the latest round of biennial transparency reports, as well as nationally determined contributions, we're seeing more and more references to countries engaging in international carbon markets. Yet at the same time, carbon markets have been facing a number of challenges with their environmental integrity, as well as their impacts on local communities. And this is occurring both whether countries are net importers or exporters of these types of carbon units, whether allowances or credits. And so there's been a number of important recognitions that addressing these issues is critical. And thirdly, it's also important that we view carbon markets as one source of overall finance for climate mitigation, that we do not use it to displace obligations that otherwise exist, for instance, under the UNFCCC, in order to ensure that Article 9 financing for climate mitigation and adaptation is still upheld and not displaced via carbon market means. So bearing in mind this backdrop, we see there's a number of areas where there's been progress, as well as areas that there's been risks emerging as we enter this new era of Paris-aligned carbon markets. We have seen, in part due to Article 6's emphasis in Article 6.1 on environmental integrity, improved recognition of its importance, in particular its recognition of the importance of environmental integrity when linking different systems together. Equally, we see growing recognition of environmental and social safeguards and benefits. These being something that were largely lacking from the first generation of carbon markets. This includes much more clear provisions as to co-benefit arrangements and attempts to ensure dispute resolution mechanisms are available. And we also see more attention being paid to the supply chain of carbon credits and identifying and ameliorating potential corruption risks along that supply chain. However, despite progress in recent years, we also still see a number of risks. There's a permeable lack of net zero alignment in the system today. We see this through some systems, indeed undoing recognition that used to distinguish between reductions and removals in the first instance. And indeed, this is becoming particularly prescient when we now have a much greater range of mitigation tools available to us, including new forms of durable carbon removal. We continue to see the lack of institutionalization of robust social environmental safeguards. So while there's recognition of their importance, often they do not end up in operative provisions. We've also seen an ongoing lack of clarity and flexibility rather in different standard setting processes, which can help cause confusion on the part of project developers as well as on the part of buyers. At the same time, we see that regulation has been emerging in a very piecemeal fashion, and there's been misalignment between the different domains of maybe direct carbon market regulation, as we'll come to unpack shortly, as well as enabling regulation and principles and standards that can also affect and permeate its implementation. And lastly, as mentioned previously, we're seeing the conflation of what were otherwise distinct financing pathways and obligations in the application and development of carbon market activities. And so it's really important across the board that these are primed to drive ambition rather than undermine it. So we see developing a roadmap as a critical contribution to helping remedy some of these risks we see in carbon market regulation to date. And in particular, we see that net zero can be a powerful North Star in this regard to align carbon markets in a robust way. We think this because net zero is a collective goal that all parties to the Paris Agreement signed up to as part of Article 4.1 of the Paris Agreement, which speaks to the balance between sinks and sources of greenhouse gas emissions within the second half of the century. But the importance of reaching this was also affirmed this year by the International Court of Justice. The aim to reach net zero is indeed an ambitious one. It requires billions of tons of emissions reductions as well as removals. And so it also helps us pay attention to regulating and ensuring a carbon market that actually delivers real mitigation outcomes that have atmospheric benefits as opposed to contributing hot air as has otherwise been alleged. And lastly, reaching net zero is also essential because it can help drive some coordinated action across borders in order to scale emissions reductions on the one hand, as well as removals, and particularly the kinds of durable carbon removal that we need to reach and sustain a state of net zero. So turning now to what the 6 pillars of the roadmap are. First, it's important to understand that when we speak of these pillars, we're really speaking as the pillars that can help shape direct carbon market regulation. So it's important in the broader white paper to understand that we define carbon market regulation broadly. We see it both speaking to the forms of direct regulation that can create carbon markets, whether they are voluntary systems or compliance carbon markets. We see enabling regulation. So this is regulation that is within the same jurisdiction, but may not specifically speak to carbon markets, as also playing a really critical role jurisdictionally. But also thematically, we see that there is strong influence from a range of principles and standards that can help also affect both supply and demand side regulation. What does this look like in practice? Well, here we can see an illustrative example of the United Kingdom's carbon market regulatory ecosystem. So we can see this combination of both direct regulation that speaks specifically to setting mitigation targets, as well as implementation mechanisms of carbon markets to achieve that, in the form of an emissions trading scheme, as well as prescriptions and principles related to voluntary and nature market integrity. We also see the interplay here of enabling regulation from both the Financial Services and Markets Act of 2000, which helps to provide certainty as to how allowances are treated from a financial perspective, as well as, of course, the UK Environment Act, which sets in place important measures to ensure that carbon projects do not cause further harm to local environments. At the same time, we see the carbon market regulatory ecosystem in the UK being strongly affected by developments such as the core carbon principles developed by the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. We also see that the Oxford Principles for Net Zero aligned carbon offsetting have been mentioned, for instance, in relation to the UK government's principles for voluntary carbon and nature market integrity. And as well, the UK woodland and peatland carbon codes have also played a significant role, and including in terms of potential integration of units into the emissions trading scheme. Now, the same model we can see in other jurisdictions. So here we see an example from Indonesia. In Indonesia, we see direct regulations speaking to carbon pricing and carbon trading in various different domains. But we also can see the similar pattern of supporting, enabling regulation coming in to assist in clarifying the procedures related to carbon exchange. But at the same time, it's not just jurisdictional measures that play an important role in forming the carbon market regulatory landscape. We also see that influential standards and principles cut across borders, and in particular, efforts here to scale the joint crediting mechanism and the standards that underpin it, which is a new mechanism undertaken by Japan that will occur through Article 6.2 cooperative approaches under the Paris Agreement. So with all that said, we'd like to unveil these 6 pillars of net zero aligned carbon market regulation. This starts with pillars that speak to determining the role of carbon markets within a given jurisdiction. It then looks to how to design net zero aligned carbon market regulation. And finally, considers how one might implement and oversee that regulation. So unpacking these pillars, we see that in terms of pillar 1, efficient and effective financing, it's critical to ensure that carbon financing is channeled towards financially additional and efficient mitigation activities and otherwise does not displace other international climate finance obligations. In terms of pillar 2, we see it as critical to distinguish between carbon removal and reduction carbon units and their respective roles in contributing to national and global net zero targets. In terms of pillar 3, ecosystem integrity, we see that it's critical to not only ensure that the unit itself has strong environmental integrity, but that also robust social and environmental safeguards are applied at a carbon project level. In terms of pillar 4, equitable responsibilities and outcomes, this speaks to the need to ensure that all relevant stakeholders are duly recognised as active agents in the design and implementation of carbon projects, and that both host countries and impacted communities within these jurisdictions receive adequate and meaningful benefits. In terms of pillar 5, creating strong institutions and mechanisms are essential in terms of ensuring robust enforcement and oversight of market mechanisms. Just as financial markets have a lot of regulation, so too do carbon markets for them to be most effective. And finally, pillar 6, ease of use. It's incredibly important for carbon markets to act as a catalytic tool to drive emissions reductions and scale removals, that they are user-friendly and accessible and do really lower barriers to entry for all types of stakeholders. So with that, I'll now pass over to my colleague Cindy Cucci, who will explore global applications of the roadmap to net zero aligned carbon regulation. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Angie, for that brilliant delving into the rationale behind why we created and developed this roadmap, and also the 6 pillars that we hope can guide governments and policymakers to really design and implement direct carbon market regulations, both to create domestic voluntary or compliance carbon markets, but also equally to engage with international carbon trading schemes, particularly those currently being developed under the UNFCCC. So Article 6 market-based mechanisms. If we could move to the next slide, please. So this roadmap recognizes that whereas the six pillars that we have developed are quite high level and in this way they are universally applicable, it applies and translates differently across different types of jurisdictions. And in this way, departing from similar guidance that has been developed currently on the regulatory ecosystem for carbon markets, this roadmap recognizes that each national context is different. So each context differs in terms of economic and development priorities, as well as with regards to their history in engaging with carbon markets or their intention to do so in the future. And notably, we distinguish between three different types of jurisdictions in order to adequately operationalize this roadmap. We differentiate between advanced economies, emerging economies, and developing economies. The main notable difference between these three types of jurisdictions is their status as either net exporters or net importers of international carbon units historically. Advanced economies, on the one hand of the spectrum, have historically been net importers of international carbon units. This means that they have historically driven the demand and they are particularly concerned with the use of carbon credits. On the other hand of the spectrum, we have developing economies. Developing economies have been historical suppliers of carbon credits. Most carbon credit projects have been situated in these economies, particularly nature-based ones. And then in the middle of these two, emerging economies are situated. Emerging economies exist in a flux state between the two, and whereas historically they have been net importers of carbon units, they are increasingly becoming emergent powerhouses of actually driving the demand behind international carbon units. If we could move to the next slide, please. So, in order to really think through how the six pillars that we developed can be really operationalized through these three different types of economies, we thought we would look systemically at all of the different types of regulations, policies, guidance, laws that exist with regards to carbon markets in these economies and see whether they are aligned with the principles or whether they are misaligned with the principles and how do they differentiate from one another. So within advanced economies, as typically net importers of carbon units, advanced economies are largely concerned with maintaining high integrity in the carbon units demand and use. Advanced economies have also typically created very robust domestic carbon markets, particularly compliance carbon markets, also known as emission trading schemes. Most notably, we have the EU ETS or the UK ETS as well. In this slide deck, we have presented Finland's principles for high integrity use of voluntary carbon markets, as well as the UK's. And these two regulatory pieces from advanced economies really demonstrate this concern with in the integrity in demand and supply of carbon units. So how can actors, private actors that within these advanced economies really utilize carbon credits that they derive internationally from particularly developing economies, and use them properly towards their own organizational net zero goals, towards domestic net zero goals, and also towards a global common purpose of net zero. Where we see a lot of pillar alignment with our roadmap within these regulations is in how they are considering ecosystem integrity. So this means that typically within advanced economies, carbon market regulations, social and environmental safeguards are really prioritized. And we also see very good practices in enforcement and oversight. For example, a lot of these economies have created very good systems of penalties in order, in case of misconduct or in case of fraud, when when carbon market actors are actually engaging with these markets. And also we are seeing good practice with ease of use. For example, we see the European Union has developed a user-friendly, publicly accessible tool in its EU reporting tool, EU ETS reporting tool. However, we do see a lot of misalignment in efficient and effective financing in the end state of net zero, and equitable sharing of outcomes and responsibilities, which are very crucial components in order to ensure that all of the carbon market regulations created can be net zero aligned. When it comes to emerging economies, on the other hand, these are typically, can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Yeah, when we come to emerging economies, these are typically both net importers and net exporters of carbon units, and they are increasingly issuing laws and policies as well as frameworks and guidelines that both create domestic carbon markets, but also equally set parameters for the engagement with international carbon systems. There has been a lot of pillar alignment in terms of ecosystem integrity, particularly again in that building and designing of very adequate social and environmental safeguards. There's also been a lot of considerations within these regulations on equitable responsibilities and outcomes, particularly when it comes to revenue sharing with affected stakeholders, enforcement and oversight. This particular piece of legislation from Pakistan, which is called the Pakistan Policy Guidelines for Trading in Carbon Markets, is concerned with really establishing those transparency and anti-corruption measures in carbon market transactions, which is quite novel. And also, these types of economies are increasingly thinking about how best can carbon market systems, both domestic and international, be utilized as efficient and effective financing tools, really differentiating between climate finance and carbon finance. However, we do see pillar misalignment in terms of the end state of net zero. So a lot of these economies are not really differentiating between different types of units and not thinking through of how carbon markets can best be used to really bring that balance between sources and sinks as envisioned by Article 4 of the Paris Agreement. And also, we don't really see considerations on the ease of use, so making carbon markets very easily accessible for all different types of stakeholders, especially for smallholders who face a lot of barriers to entry into these systems. And then finally, we have developing economies. Developing economies have been important suppliers of carbon units, and they are becoming increasingly so in recent years. And these types of jurisdictions have been pioneers in creating very robust frameworks for particularly engaging with international carbon market schemes. And we see from countries all across Africa, specifically from Zambia to Ghana, they are really creating these robust regulations, driving domestic engagement with Article 6.2 and Article 6.4. And there will be emerging frameworks on Article 6.8 once that is developed as well. Where we see pillar alignment in these regulations from these types of jurisdictions is again in ecosystem integrity. This is unsurprising, as integrity issues have really been at the forefront of the criticism that carbon market mechanisms have faced. So based on the lessons learned, these regulations are really reflecting these lessons and are really trying to provide these integrity both socially and environmentally in their engagement with carbon markets. We also see very good practices in equitable responsibilities and outcomes, specifically with Indigenous peoples and impacted local communities, enforcement and oversight, and also efficient and effective financing. But again, similarly to advanced economies and emerging economies, that crucial role of the end state of net zero. So really envisioning how carbon markets can be best utilized to reach global net zero is not really considered within these regulations, and that is one of the main pillars that is lacking, and what we truly want this roadmap to provide guidance on. Now I will pass it on to our colleague, Dr. Bhavya Gupta, to give some best practices and examples in net zero aligned carbon market regulation.
Thank you, Cindy. So, having heard about the pillars and about how it can be operationalized across different types of countries, I'll now begin with providing a macro level overview of what is the state of global carbon market regulation, and then delve a little bit deeper into best practices or policy features in different jurisdictions that emerge with regard to alignment with some of the pillars which are outlined or highlighted in the roadmap. So, if you could move to the next slide. Thank you. So, looking globally at carbon market regulation, we are all aware that it's increasing globally. The World Bank's carbon pricing dashboard reports over 80 carbon pricing schemes in operation globally, both carbon taxes and ETSs. And in Oxford, a sister project, which is the Climate Policy Monitor that I'm a part of, is also tracks climate policies in different domains. And one of the domains that we've started tracking this year is the generation, use, and exchange of carbon credits, both in compliance and voluntary markets. So the data for this will be released in the first week of November. But in terms of some early findings, we are happy to report 106 carbon crediting rules across 37 surveyed jurisdictions. And from the map, you can see that these are distributed quite widely across advanced, emerging, developing economies, as well as across a range of geographies. 70% of these policies have also come online after 2020, reflecting a recent spate of regulatory activity. And then the monitor data actually goes beyond just providing information about whether a policy exists or not to also examining its features, the obligations it imposes on targeted entities, who are the targeted entities, and how stringent these policies are. So if we could move to the next slide. So in terms of the domain of carbon crediting rules, we divided objectives of these policies across 4 buckets. So policies could govern the criteria for carbon credit generation or eligibility, their usage and compliance of voluntary markets, their exchange as a financial instrument, or it could also operationalize Paris Agreement mechanisms. And these are complementary objectives, and we find across 37 jurisdictions, over half of them, so 18 out of 37, actually have regulations in place. Could be one, could be several, that cover this entire spectrum of credit generation, use, exchange, and the implementation of Article 6. Now, moving from the aggregate to the specific and talking about individual pillar alignment of policies. So in terms of pillar 1, which is about efficient and effective financing, this is more about referring or situating carbon markets as one among several policy tools to mobilize climate finance and also to achieve emissions reduction in the most cost-effective and efficient manner. And there's a few different ways in which this has been operationalized into practice. So one of these could be using carbon markets as tools to achieve their carbon budgets or carbon removal budgets, for example, in the case of UK. Another bucket could be using carbon markets to mobilize carbon finance. And an example here would be Portugal, which has created its domestic voluntary carbon market, and Ghana, which explicitly mentions in its carbon market regulation to use Article 6 frameworks to primarily finance conditional mitigation activities. In the third bucket, there's policies which go beyond the use of carbon markets to mobilize finance or to reduce emissions from particular sectors. So examples here would be Rwanda, Costa Rica, which has a payments for ecosystem services approach, which develops climate finance bundles for nature-based solutions, and they don't directly incorporate finance from carbon markets. And then most recently, there's Brazil's Tropical Forest Forever facility, which uses an innovative blended finance approach and leverages private finance for forest conservation. So it's much more direct than the using carbon markets. And then an atypical example here is Egypt, which has regulations which try to reduce the transaction cost with regard to exchanging carbon credits. It actually has a slew of regulations that aim to define the legal status of carbon credits as a financial instrument and facilitate their exchange. Then moving to pillar 2, which is about the end state of net zero. So this pillar draws on the logic that carbon markets should be geared towards helping countries reach domestic net zero targets and move closer towards a state of global net zero. And there's a temporal dimension to this. And the operationalization of these pillars, as Cindy mentioned, would look a little different for net importers of these carbon units and net exporters of these carbon units. So for net importers of carbon units, the idea is that carbon unit purchases are aligned with their carbon budgets, and they aim to use only durable removals to address their residual emissions. So we see that this has been codified in laws in Denmark and in the UK, which is exploring to integrate durable carbon removal into its ETS. For net exporters of carbon credits, the concern is that credits that are transferred internationally in terms of mitigation outcomes do not result in these countries defaulting on their own NDC commitments. And here we see Ghana requires the creation of a buffer pool to this end to prevent NDC default in the future. Uganda has a grandfathering provision in its 2025 law, which phases out old projects to ensure new project development. And then the final 2 examples are with regard to aligning carbon markets with the national carbon budget. And here there's an example of Costa Rica, whose carbon market mechanism seeks to directly align with the country's NDC, and China's national compliance ETS, which is built off of several pilot ETS schemes at the city and the province level. Moving to the third pillar of ecosystem integrity. So, whereas the first two pillars are more about situating the role of carbon markets, pillars 3 to 6 are about the features of the carbon markets itself. And ecosystem integrity, encompassing environmental and social integrity, is perhaps the one which has seen or witnessed the most activity, yet is also the most contentious. So, we do see some good practices emerging here, although it still remains a work in progress. Particularly, some good practices emerged with regard to the use of standards and a convergence on international standards in terms of ascertaining the integrity of carbon units. So, for example, the EU's carbon removal certification framework is a good example here. In terms of international standards, Rwanda has adopted the World Bank standardized crediting framework to support fulfillment of its NDC. There's also a reliance on ISO standards increasingly. So Egypt, India, and Indonesia are a few countries which have used ISO standards for the accreditation of validation and verification bodies, as well as processes to conduct validation and verification for carbon projects. The only caveat here would be with regard to social integrity criteria, which with regard to which there is still a very glaring gap. So some of the monitored data reveals that out of the 106 policies that we've surveyed, only less than a fifth of all of these across 13 jurisdictions require any social integrity criteria that carbon credits must fulfill, either during generation or their eligibility for use in the compliance or voluntary market. Moving to the fourth pillar now, which is about equitable responsibilities and outcomes. So, this pertains more to the procedural and distributive fairness in carbon market regulation, particularly during the process of creating these carbon reducing or removing units. So, with regard to benefit sharing at the international level, Japan's joint crediting mechanism is a very good example, which, when engaging with global south or other countries, this mechanism also aims at capacity building, knowledge sharing, and transferring decarbonization technologies and infrastructure to these countries. At the national level, some good practices with regard to the engagement of and consultation with impacted communities, particularly Indigenous peoples, is seen in Australia, where the rights of Indigenous communities on land based projects are laid out in project level methodologies. Also, the case for Indonesia, where local forest communities are included as project proponents in the forestry sector carbon offsetting activities. The Philippines recognizes the free, prior, and informed consent in carbon projects as located in ancestral domains as a constitutional right. And similarly, Colombia recognizes indigenous people as the environmental authorities over their territories. With regard to benefit sharing arrangements, so we see some good practices emerging in these 6 jurisdictions: Brazil, Costa Rica, Kenya, Rwanda, Turkey, and Tanzania. So it looks good on like an individual level, but our monitor data also reveals that this is only seen in very few policies on an aggregate level. So only 10 out of 106 policies in these 6 jurisdictions explicitly require that financial revenues raised from generation or trade of carbon credits be used in benefit sharing arrangements with the impacted communities. So moving now to pillar 5, which is enforcement and oversight. So this is perhaps the most crucial yet glaring gap in the implementation and effectiveness of carbon markets. And here, enforcement could be composed of 2 different dimensions. So, one would be a policy design element with regard to what are the sanctions for non compliance with any provision in a particular carbon market policy, and then the actual enforcement of these sanctions. So here again, some silos of good practice emerge from, for example, California, whose voluntary Carbon Market Disclosure Act imposes fines on entities which fail to publicly disclose requisite information on the use of carbon credits, on their integrity, and to what purpose they've been used. Uganda has instituted criminal liability from fines to imprisonment for project developers that don't meet transparency requirements. Another form of enforcement is dispute resolution mechanisms, a venue where conflicts between project developers and impacted communities, for instance, can be brought in, and these have been created by Zambia and Kenya. And then a final level of or a final venue for enforcement would be delegated monitoring in terms of monitoring, reporting, and verification protocols. So these serve as a form of delegated monitoring where these entities are entrusted with ensuring the proper functioning of carbon markets. And institutional arrangements or governance forms to carry out these activities have been witnessed in Vietnam. as well as in Turkey, whose new climate law establishes a national level carbon markets board for exactly this purpose. And then finally, moving to pillar 6 on the ease of use of carbon markets. If we could, yeah. So this also pertains to maybe two buckets. So first would be making carbon markets accessible to all potential participating stakeholders, both state and non-state actors. And here there are examples like Cindy mentioned of the European Union and its ETS reporting tool. Similarly, Vietnam has established regulation to encourage or to foster awareness of carbon market frameworks in the communities. In terms of technological advancements, there's also a notable example of Zimbabwe, which introduced the world's first blockchain-based national carbon registry to improve transparency. And then finally, enhancing ease of use is also about enhancing the interoperability of carbon markets. And here, India's carbon credit trading scheme, which is like a framework carbon market regulation, it aims to enhance interoperability across registry methodology standards, and it has released detailed procedures for non-covered entities to issue credits voluntarily that can be used for offsetting purposes. And so that concludes the 6 pillars, and I now hand back over to Inji.
Much, Bhavya, for that presentation, unpacking some of the concrete examples of carbon market regulation best practice that we see. We'll now move to the closing, just to wrap up that carbon markets are increasing in their complexity, as well as the various forms of ways in which they're manifesting around the globe, both domestically as well as internationally. This has meant that they're now at a critical juncture globally where they could either help or hinder the goals towards net zero. Now, regulation plays an essential role in this landscape, but one that is oftentimes obscured. Yet, with developing net zero aligned carbon market regulatory practices can indeed be a win-win opportunity for all economies. And as we unpack in the roadmap itself, whether this be advanced, emerging, or developing economies, all have the potential to maximize the full opportunities from engaging in the Paris Agreement, providing clarity for governments in terms of how they can efficiently and effectively manage the scale of mitigation related activities, whether domestically and or abroad, for corporates that can help them guide their decarbonisation investments both within and beyond their value chain, as well as for the general public. It can help them restore faith in carbon markets as an efficient means of delivering mitigation whilst ensuring that the rights of local communities and Indigenous peoples are safeguarded, as well as protections for the environment. So just to close out, to say there'll be many more opportunities to engage with the roadmap to net zero aligned carbon market regulation in the coming months. Next month we'll be at pre-COP in Sao Paulo, as well as COP30 in Belém. So please do reach out if you'd like to chat further or set up a bilateral. And I'd also like to draw attention to the fact we have a broader range of resources to support net zero aligned responsible use of carbon mechanisms. This includes the guidelines for setting a net zero aligned internal carbon price, principles for net zero aligned carbon offsetting and practitioners handbook, the offsetting principles themselves, which help to guide organizations, both public and private, in establishing offsetting practices. We also have a policy brief on a net zero aligned Paris Agreement crediting mechanism under Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement. We further have a working paper that explores mutualization claims in the era of Article 6, exploring what it means to invest in durable carbon removal in the era of corresponding adjustments. And lastly, but no means leastly, we have the Oxford Principles for Responsible Engagement with Article 6 that again speaks to efforts to regulate both the supply side of carbon markets as well as the demand side in order to ensure integrity. With that, I'll bring this explainer to a close. Feel free to scan here to access the full working paper, but otherwise we look forward to any questions or insights that you may have. Thank you so much.